A crowd surged through the streets of Boston on March 5, 1770, their voices rising against the chill of the evening air. Tension crackled like the winter frost underfoot. In the midst of the gathering, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, stood defiantly at the forefront. His broad shoulders squared against the line of British soldiers stationed near the customs house. The soldiers, led by Captain Thomas Preston, were on edge, their muskets glinting dully in the fading light. The crowd, a mix of laborers, apprentices, and angry citizens, had been hurling insults and snowballs, their frustrations boiling over after years of oppressive taxation. "You are a pack of cowards," shouted one man, his breath visible in the cold air. "Why don't you fire on us?" The soldiers, outnumbered and feeling the pressure of the rising mob, tightened their grips around the butts of their weapons. In that charged moment, a snowball struck one of the soldiers, a young private named Hugh Montgomery, hitting him squarely in the face. Montgomery stumbled back, his anger igniting. He shouted for reinforcements, but the chaos was already unfolding. In the confusion, a shot rang out, echoing in the narrow streets. It was not clear who fired first, but the sound shattered the air like thunder. Montgomery, panicked and driven by fear, pulled the trigger of his musket. The bullet struck Crispus Attucks, who staggered, blood blossoming across his chest. "I am not afraid to die," Attucks cried, falling to the ground. The words hung heavy in the air, mingling with the shouts of the crowd. In that moment, the anger of the colonists turned to horror and disbelief as they witnessed the first martyr of the American Revolution. The chaos escalated, a second shot fired, followed by another. Samuel Gray and James Caldwell fell, their lives extinguished in an instant. The crowd, now paralyzed by shock, began to retreat, yet the damage was done. 5 men lay dead or dying in the street, their blood staining the snow, a stark reminder of the escalating conflict between the colonies and British authority. But to understand how we got here, in the years leading up to the Boston Massacre, Boston was a city teetering on the edge of turmoil. The year was 1770, a time when the air was thick with discontent. The streets, lined with narrow wooden houses and bustling markets, echoed with the voices of merchants, laborers, and a diverse population, each person grappling with the weight of British rule. The growing resentment was palpable, fueled by oppressive taxes and the increasingly visible presence of British soldiers. Among the townspeople was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, who had earned his living as a sailor. He was known for his strong demeanor and a fierce sense of justice. On the evening of March 5, 1770, he found himself amidst a crowd that had gathered outside the custom house, their voices rising in anger against the British soldiers stationed there. Tensions had been escalating for months, particularly after the imposition of the Townshend Acts in 1767, which levied new taxes on everyday goods like tea, glass, and paper. Attucks was not just a bystander, he was emblematic of a growing fury against colonial oppression. As the crowd grew larger that night, it included figures like Samuel Adams, a fervent advocate for colonial rights. Adams was a master of rhetoric, known for his ability to stir emotions and rally support. He urged the crowd to stand firm against the soldiers, framing their struggle as a fight for liberty. "It is not just our money they seek to take," he proclaimed, "but our very rights as men." His words resonated deeply, igniting a fire in the hearts of those present. On the other side stood Captain Thomas Preston, a British officer responsible for maintaining order among the troops. Preston, a man of discipline and duty, faced the impossible task of managing a wary populace while ensuring the safety of his men. He had witnessed firsthand the growing hostility, and he understood the precariousness of their situation. As he looked out at the crowd, he felt the tension crackling in the air. "Hold your fire," he commanded his men, fully aware that one moment of panic could lead to catastrophe. The British soldiers, many of whom were young and inexperienced, were stationed in Boston as part of a broader strategy to assert British authority over the increasingly rebellious colonies. Among them was Private Hugh Montgomery, who had enlisted not out of loyalty to the Crown, but out of necessity, driven by the need for a steady wage during difficult times. He stood at the ready, his musket gripped tightly in his hands, yet he was terrified of the growing crowd. The clamor of angry voices made him question whether he was on the right side of this conflict. As night fell, the atmosphere grew more charged. The crowd was not merely protesting, they were venting years of frustration. A snowball, packed tightly with ice, struck Montgomery on the side of his head, snapping him to attention. In that moment, fear and adrenaline surged through him. The tension escalated, and he, along with his fellow soldiers, felt the weight of the moment pressing down. It was reported later that in the chaos, someone shouted, "Fire!" The command was unclear, but panic spread among the soldiers, leading to a tragic misfire. While the soldiers braced themselves against the jeering crowd, the people of Boston were not only responding to the immediate situation, but also to a history of grievances. The Stamp Act of 1765 had already ignited the flame of rebellion, followed by the Townshend Acts, which felt like salt in the wounds of a wounded populace. As the colonists sought to assert their rights, they faced fierce resistance from the British government, which was determined to maintain control over its colonies. Among the voices in the crowd was James Caldwell, a local wigmaker and a passionate supporter of the colonial cause. Caldwell had lost business due to the boycotts against British goods, and he felt the pressure of rising costs. He shouted for the crowd to stand firm. "We must not cower before tyranny. Put down your tea and take up your cause." His passion echoed the sentiments of many who felt suffocated by ongoing British policies. This was the world that led to the Boston Massacre, a world filled with both hope and despair. The streets were alive with the hum of daily activities, merchants haggling over prices, children playing in the alleys, and the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Yet beneath the surface, the simmering tensions were a constant reminder of the fragility of peace. As the crowd gathered that fateful evening, one could sense the palpable fear and anger as much as the resolve. "What do we want?" a voice cried out, and the reply came back, "Liberty." It was a battle cry that not only resonated in Boston, but across the 13 colonies. The desire for independence was growing stronger, and with it came a deepening conviction that something had to change. The origins of the Boston Massacre lay not just in the chaos of that night, but in the accumulated grievances of a people yearning to be heard. It was a culmination of years of hardship and struggle, of people like Attucks, Adams, Caldwell, and Montgomery, each representing different facets of a society on the brink of transformation. The clash that night would become a pivotal moment, marking the point of no return in the quest for American independence. In the aftermath, the streets of Boston would never feel the same. The events of that night would be etched into the collective memory of a nation yearning for freedom, a nation that was beginning to find its voice. And as dawn broke over the city, the consequences of that fateful evening would ripple through history, forever changing the course of the American Revolution. Tensions in Boston continued to rise in the days following the confrontation on March 5, 1770. The memory of Crispus Attucks and the other fallen men, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and others, echoed through the streets, transforming them into symbols of resistance. Crispus Attucks, described by the local press as a martyr, became a focal point for the growing unrest. His death ignited a firestorm of outrage among the colonists, who began to view the British soldiers not merely as enforcers of law, but as oppressors, standing against their rights as Englishmen. On March the 9th, just 4 days after the massacre, Samuel Adams, a prominent leader of the Sons of Liberty, spearheaded a gathering at Faneuil Hall. He addressed a crowd of concerned citizens, emphasizing the need for unity in the face of tyranny. "If we do not stand together, we shall fall one by one," he implored, rallying the crowd with a passionate call for action. The assembly erupted in fervor, with voices raised in agreement, echoing the sentiments of a burgeoning desire for independence. This event marked a pivotal moment in the rise of colonial activism, where the seeds of rebellion were being sown in the hearts of ordinary men and women. As the week unfolded, the streets of Boston became increasingly charged with emotion. The citizens, fueled by the narrative of martyrdom, began to organize protests and boycotts against British goods. Newspapers, such as the Boston Gazette, played a crucial role in spreading the word. They published articles that characterized the British soldiers as mercenaries, killing innocent civilians in cold blood. One article stated, "The blood of our fellow countrymen cries out for justice," encapsulating the fervent anger that had taken root among the populace. The growing tide of resentment was not limited to Boston. Across the colonies, the events of the massacre were stirring sympathy and solidarity. Committees of correspondence began to form, creating a network of communication between the colonies. They shared news and organized collective responses to British policies. The Massachusetts Assembly took further action on June 17, 1774, by officially sending a letter to the other colonies calling for a united front against British oppression. "An injury to one is an injury to all," they proclaimed, a sentiment that would resonate deeply as the revolutionary spirit spread like wildfire. In the ensuing months, the name Crispus Attucks became synonymous with the struggle for liberty. Memorials were erected, and his image appeared in pamphlets and broadsides. People remembered him not just as a victim of British aggression, but as a symbol of courage and defiance. On the anniversary of the massacre, the citizens gathered in somber remembrance, carrying banners adorned with his name. The mood was both mournful and resolute. They were determined not to let his sacrifice be in vain. As the summer wore on, the British government attempted to quell the rising unrest by sending additional troops to Boston. This move only intensified the situation as the presence of more soldiers escalated the fears of the colonists. On June 10, 1774, a large crowd confronted a contingent of British troops, demanding their withdrawal. The soldiers, feeling the pressure of the hostile crowd, stood firm, their muskets at the ready. One soldier later recounted, "We felt as if we were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the only way back was through violence." The air was thick with tension, and the potential for another confrontation loomed large. Meanwhile, the colonies were abuzz with discussions about rights and governance. The idea of representation, so central to the discontent, began to take on a more radical form. Pamphleteers like Thomas Paine emerged, advocating for independence and a break from the British Crown. In his pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776, Paine argued passionately that the colonies had the right to govern themselves. "It is time to part," he wrote, urging the colonists to reject any notion of reconciliation with Britain. His words struck a chord, resonating with those who had been stirred by the events of the Boston Massacre. The atmosphere in Boston shifted dramatically as the events of the previous months culminated in a broader revolutionary fervor. The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, uniting delegates from 12 colonies. They gathered to discuss their grievances and formulate a response to British policies. The meeting was marked by heated debates, but a shared resolve emerged. The colonies would not back down. "We must stand firm and united," declared Patrick Henry, a voice of passion and conviction. His words echoed through the halls, inspiring delegates to act in defiance of British authority. As winter approached, the tensions remained palpable. The citizens of Boston, emboldened by their shared experiences, prepared for what they sensed was an inevitable conflict. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, became a demonstration of their resolve against British taxation. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, colonists dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor, defiantly rejecting the Tea Act. The act of rebellion was not just about tea. It represented a refusal to accept subjugation. In the wake of these events, the British Parliament responded harshly, enacting the coercive acts, which were viewed as punitive measures against the colonies. This only fueled the fire of rebellion. The colonists, now more than ever, recognized that their rights were at stake. They were no longer merely subjects of the crown. They were becoming a people united by a shared purpose. The rise of revolutionary sentiment was palpable, echoing through the streets of Boston and beyond, as the people grappled with their identities and aspirations. By early 1775, the stage was set for open conflict. The events that began on that fateful night of March 5, 1770, had spiraled into a full-blown movement for independence. The sacrifices of Crispus Attucks and his fellow victims had ignited a flame that could not be extinguished. The people were ready to fight for their rights, for their liberties, and for their future. The memory of that night became a rallying cry, a reminder that the struggle for freedom was worth every sacrifice. The air in Boston was thick with tension on the evening of March 5th, 1770. The previous months had seen a steady rise in hostilities between the colonists and British soldiers, whose presence was increasingly unwelcome. The imposition of the Townshend Acts in 1767 had only deepened the divide, as these laws placed duties on imported goods, sparking boycotts and protests across the colonies. In Boston, the simmering anger reached a boiling point that night, culminating in an event that would forever alter the course of American history. As dusk settled over the city, a group of colonists gathered near the Custom House on King Street, their voices rising in defiance against the British troops stationed there. Among them stood Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, known for his spirited resistance against oppression. The crowd, estimated at around 100, was growing increasingly agitated, feeling the weight of British authority pressing down upon them like a heavy shroud. On that fateful night, Captain Thomas Preston commanded a small contingent of soldiers, including Private Hugh Montgomery, to disperse the crowd. Preston, a veteran of many conflicts, understood the importance of controlling the situation. He was acutely aware of the potential for violence, yet the soldiers were met with a barrage of insults and threats. The colonists hurled snowballs and debris, which struck the soldiers, igniting a furious response. In the chaos that ensued, Montgomery found himself startled by a snowball that struck his shoulder. This seemingly innocuous act triggered a cascade of panic. Preston shouted for discipline, but the tension was palpable. The soldiers, feeling cornered and threatened, were on edge. In the midst of this turmoil, it became impossible to discern friend from foe. "Fire! Fire!" someone shouted, and in an instant the command was given. Montgomery, lost in the frenzy of fear and anger, pulled the trigger of his musket. The bullet struck Crispus Attucks squarely in the chest, and he collapsed, a life extinguished in an instant. Seconds later, shots rang out, echoing through the streets. Samuel Gray and James Caldwell fell alongside him, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the crowd erupted into chaos. 3 other men were wounded that night, with a combined death toll reaching 5. The horror of the moment was aptly captured by an eyewitness who later recounted, "The streets were stained with the blood of our own people, a sight that will haunt us forever." The aftermath of the shooting was swift and devastating. Panic spread as news of the massacre traveled through the city like wildfire. The colonial community erupted in outrage, and in the days that followed, the events of that night became a rallying cry against British tyranny. Samuel Adams, a prominent leader of the resistance, seized upon the tragedy to galvanize public sentiment. In a meeting held just days later at Faneuil Hall, Adams proclaimed, "This is a massacre. We must unite against this tyranny. Their blood cries out for justice." His impassioned words resonated deeply among the gathered crowd, igniting their collective resolve. The Boston Massacre was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a symbol of colonial oppression and the cost of resistance. The British government, keenly aware of the damage done, sought to contain the fallout. Captain Preston and the soldiers were arrested and put on trial. The circumstances of the shooting were scrutinized, with Adams and other patriots using the trials to further their cause. "The blood of our brethren demands retribution," Adams asserted, framing the soldiers as oppressors while casting the victims as martyrs in the struggle for freedom. The trials, held in the summer of 1770, drew considerable attention. John Adams, a future president of the United States and cousin to Samuel Adams, represented Captain Preston and his men, believing in the right to a fair trial, even for those accused of such a heinous act. In a striking moment during the proceedings, Adams argued, "We are all men, and we are all entitled to justice." The jury ultimately acquitted Preston and his men, citing self-defense, further infuriating the colonists and deepening their resolve against British rule. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of the Boston Massacre continued to resonate throughout the colonies. It served as a catalyst for the burgeoning resistance movement, leading to the formation of committees of correspondence to unify the colonies against British oppression. The once isolated grievances of the colonists began to coalesce into a broader movement toward independence. as the pain and anger from that night spurred them into action. The impact of the Boston Massacre echoed far beyond the streets of Boston. It ignited a fervor for liberty that would eventually culminate in the American Revolution. Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, and the others were remembered not merely as victims, but as martyrs whose sacrifice illuminated the path toward independence. Their names became synonymous with the fight for freedom, etched into the collective memory of a nation yearning to break free from tyranny. In the years that followed, the events of that night would be immortalized in history. Paul Revere's famous engraving depicted the soldiers firing upon the unarmed crowd, a powerful image that further inflamed colonial sentiment against Britain. The phrase "no taxation without representation" became a rallying cry, rooted in the injustices that had unfolded that tragic evening. As the Revolutionary War loomed on the horizon, the Boston Massacre remained a stark reminder of the human cost of oppression. It underscored the reality that the fight for liberty would demand sacrifices, lives, families, and dreams. In this crucible of conflict, the people of Boston and the colonies were irrevocably transformed, their anger channeled into a determination to forge a new nation. The events of that night on King Street became a cornerstone of American identity. The struggles faced by Attucks and his compatriots were not forgotten. They lived on in the hearts of those who sought liberty and justice. The Boston Massacre marked a pivotal moment in the journey toward independence, one that would resonate for generations to come. On the evening of March 5, 1770, the streets of Boston echoed with the distant sounds of discontent. The air was thick with the frustrations of a populace fed up with oppressive legislation and the presence of British soldiers. Just days before, on March 2nd, Samuel Adams had addressed a gathering at Faneuil Hall, urging the citizens to unite against the tyranny of the Townshend Acts. His words ignited a fervor among the townspeople. They were no longer passive recipients of British rule, but rather active participants in their own destiny. The tensions were palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. As night fell, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, found himself at the forefront of the crowd that had gathered near the custom house. Attucks, known for his stature and assertiveness, had become a symbol of the struggle against oppression. He stood resolute amid a throng of his fellow colonists who were filled with anger and purpose. The crowd swelled, numbering about 300, as they hurled insults at the British soldiers stationed nearby, led by Captain Thomas Preston. The air was electric with hostility, and the murmur of discontent transformed into shouts demanding justice. At the front line of this charged atmosphere was Private Hugh Montgomery, a British soldier who had been stationed in Boston to enforce the unpopular laws. Montgomery, feeling the weight of the crowd's anger, stood with his fellow soldiers, weapons at the ready. The night was dark, but the tension was illuminated by the torches held by the colonists. In the chaos, the soldiers felt besieged, and fear began to seep into their ranks. Montgomery's heart raced as a snowball struck him, an unexpected and humiliating assault. This was the moment when the simmering tension boiled over. With the crowd emboldened, Attucks stepped forward, his voice rising above the din. "You are slaves. We will not be ruled by tyranny," he shouted, rallying the spirits of those around him. The soldiers, feeling cornered and threatened, responded to the rallying cries with uncertainty. Captain Preston, attempting to maintain order, shouted for the crowd to disperse. But the mob was deaf to his pleas, their anger transforming into a collective roar, demanding freedom. As the situation escalated, the first shot rang out. An accident, a misfire from one of the soldiers, but it shattered the night and the delicate balance of tension. "Fire! Fire!" shouted Montgomery. But in the chaos, multiple shots followed, and the air filled with cries of horror. Attucks was struck in the chest, collapsing to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. He became the first martyr of the American Revolution. Witnesses recounted the chaos. Samuel Gray, another victim, fell to the ground, the blood seeping into the snow. "I heard the shots and saw Crispus fall," one bystander later testified. "It was as if the world had stopped." In total, 5 men lay dead on the cold cobblestones, their blood soaking into the streets of a city on the brink of revolution. In the aftermath, the scene was one of confusion and despair. The crowd dispersed, grief-stricken and enraged, leaving behind the fallen men who would become symbols of the struggle against British tyranny. The soldiers, traumatized by the violence, retreated to the custom house, their resolve shattered. Captain Preston and his men would soon face trial for the deaths they had caused, but the damage had been done. The Boston Massacre, as it would come to be known, was a turning point in the colony's fight for independence. In the days that followed, the city mourned its dead, while the anger simmered just beneath the surface. Samuel Adams wasted no time in leveraging the tragedy to galvanize the colonies. He organized a memorial for the victims, urging the people to remember their sacrifice. "They died for our liberty," he proclaimed at the gathering. "Let their blood be a reminder of our fight against oppression." The memory of Attucks and the others became a rallying cry, their names etched into the hearts of the colonists as they prepared for the battles to come. As the trial of Captain Preston began in late 1770, the atmosphere in Boston remained charged. The courtroom was packed with citizens eager to witness the proceedings. John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams and a future president, took on the role of defense attorney for Preston. He believed in the rule of law, even for those whose actions had incited such chaos. "Facts are stubborn things," he stated during the trial, emphasizing the importance of justice over vengeance. The outcome would shape public perception and further ignite the flames of rebellion. Ultimately, the jury acquitted Preston and some of the soldiers, citing self-defense amidst the mob's aggression. This verdict, rather than calming the unrest, fueled it. The colonies were now united in their outrage, their resolve only strengthened by the injustice they perceived. "We shall not be ruled by those who seek to oppress us," Samuel Adams declared, echoing the sentiments of many. The Boston Massacre was more than just an immediate tragedy. It marked a significant escalation in the struggle for independence. The deaths of Attucks, Gray, and the others became emblematic of the fight against British authority, creating a narrative that would resonate throughout the colonies. The memory of those lost that fateful night would inspire men and women to rise against tyranny, paving the way for a revolution. As the evening shadows stretched over the cobbled streets of Boston, the legacy of that night settled in the hearts of the citizens. They were no longer just subjects of a distant crown. They were a people united by a shared desire for freedom, willing to stand against oppression and prepared to fight for their rights. The turning point had been reached, and the course of history was forever altered. The air in Boston felt heavy in the days following the tragic events of March 5, 1770. The echoes of gunfire lingered, blending with the whispers of anger and sorrow that swept through the streets. The bodies of the fallen, Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and others, were buried. But their deaths left a profound void in the community. Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, had emerged as an unexpected symbol of resistance. His loss resonated deeply, and for many he became a martyr for the cause of liberty. In the wake of the Boston Massacre, the town found itself divided. Loyalists and patriots clashed in heated debates, their voices rising and falling like the tides. One of those caught in this tumultuous sea was Samuel Adams, who recognized the potential of tragedy to galvanize the colonial cause. "The blood of our countrymen will not have been shed in vain," he proclaimed at a meeting held at Faneuil Hall shortly after the incident, rallying the crowd with promises of justice and action. His words echoed in the minds of many, igniting a fervor that would soon take root across the colonies. The British authorities, aware of the growing unrest, sought to quell the discontent. They dispatched reinforcements to Boston, further aggravating the already tense situation. Among the soldiers stationed in the city, one man stood out: Captain Thomas Preston, who had commanded the troops during the confrontation. Haunted by the events of that fateful night, Preston faced growing animosity from the townspeople. He later wrote, "I was the unhappy instrument of their destruction, bearing the weight of guilt for the lives lost under his command." His words reflected the complex emotions swirling around the massacre. For him, it was not just a political incident, but a personal tragedy. In the following weeks, memorials sprang up in Boston, each one a testament to the lives lost. Crispus Attucks was remembered not only for his death, but for his life, a man who had fought for his place in a world that often sought to deny him. Public gatherings became common as citizens spoke of their grief and outrage, often invoking Attux's name as a rallying point for their discontent. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," took on new life, echoing through the streets as a call to arms against British oppression. But grief was not the only emotion coursing through the streets of Boston. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at a moment's notice. As the weeks turned to months, the town was transformed. Loyalists faced boycotts, and British goods were shunned in favor of locally produced items. The Sons of Liberty, a group formed to resist British rule, grew in influence, organizing protests and disseminating pamphlets that detailed the injustices faced by the colonists. Their efforts were bolstered by the events of March 5th, transforming a singular incident into a powerful narrative of resistance. One such pamphlet, authored by none other than Paul Revere, depicted the massacre in stark, vivid detail. It portrayed British soldiers as ruthless aggressors, firing upon innocent civilians. This graphic imagery fueled further outrage, prompting more colonists to join the growing movement for independence. Revere's artistry was not merely for shock value, it was a strategic tool aimed at uniting colonists against a common enemy. His work resonated deeply with those who had lost loved ones and those who feared for their own safety. In court, the aftermath of the massacre unfolded in a tense atmosphere. Captain Preston and his men faced charges, and the trial became a spectacle, drawing attention from across the colonies. Notably, John Adams, a future president and a known patriot, defended Preston. His controversial decision to represent the soldiers stemmed from a belief in fair trials, even for those he politically opposed. "The law is the law, and we must not abandon it," he defended, showcasing his commitment to justice amidst chaos. The trial ultimately concluded with the acquittal of Preston and his men, a decision that further inflamed the already smoldering tensions between Bostonians and British authorities. As the year progressed, the Boston Massacre became a pivotal moment in the narrative of the American Revolution. Its impact rippled beyond the borders of Boston, influencing other colonies to act. In Virginia, Patrick Henry invoked the memory of the fallen in his fiery speeches, urging his fellow colonists to prepare for the fight for freedom. "Give me liberty or give me death," he famously declared, echoing the sentiments of a burgeoning nation ready to rise. Yet amid the fervor, the personal toll of the massacre lingered. Families mourned. Crispus Attux's mother, a woman of considerable strength, grappled with the loss of her son. "He was a good man," she would later say, reflecting on the life he had led and the sacrifice he had made. Such statements revealed the human side of the conflict, reminding all that behind the rhetoric and the politics were real lives affected by the struggle for freedom. In the months that followed, Boston transformed into a battleground of ideas and ideologies. The massacre shifted from a singular event to a symbol of the growing determination among colonists to break free from British rule. The streets were filled with discussions of liberty, justice, and the rights of men, conversations that would lay the groundwork for a revolution. As the specter of war loomed on the horizon, the lives of those in Boston would never be the same. The memory of that fateful night, marked by loss and courage, would continue to resonate, fueling the flames of revolution in the hearts of many. The aftermath of the Boston Massacre was not merely a reflection of grief. It was a crucible that forged a collective identity among the colonists. In every heart, the call to action grew louder, echoing the names of the fallen and invoking a future where freedom would reign. As they looked to rebuild their lives, they also prepared to fight for the ideals that had been ignited by bloodshed. The streets of Boston would become a testament to their resilience, carrying forward the legacy of those who had sacrificed everything for liberty. In the wake of the Boston Massacre on March 3, 1770, the tragic events of that night began to solidify into a powerful narrative, one that would resonate throughout American history. The deaths of 5 men, including Crispus Attux, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and others, transformed from a chaotic confrontation into a potent symbol of colonial resistance. Attux, with his mixed African and Native American heritage, emerged as a martyr, a figure representing the struggle against British oppression. This martyrdom ignited a firestorm of revolutionary sentiment across the colonies. In the immediate aftermath, the incident was carefully curated by leaders like Samuel Adams, who seized upon the tragedy to rally support against British rule. Adams and the Sons of Liberty produced pamphlets that depicted the soldiers as brutal oppressors and the deceased colonists as noble victims. One pamphlet described the event as a massacre, a term that would echo through time and shape public perception. The rhetoric used to describe the event painted a stark picture of tyranny versus liberty, amplifying the outrage felt by many colonists. The phrase "blood of the martyrs" gained traction as this tragic event was woven into the larger narrative of the fight for independence. As the years progressed, the Boston Massacre became mythologized, its details often embellished for political purposes. In 1772, Paul Revere created an iconic engraving that depicted the incident, showing a line of British soldiers firing into a peaceful crowd. This image, more than any word, seared the memory of the event into the minds of colonists. Revere's engraving, despite its artistic liberties, became a rallying cry, a visual representation of the struggle against tyranny that fueled the revolutionary spirit. It is worth noting that Revere himself was not present at the event. His interpretation was a blend of fact and artistic license, yet it resonated profoundly with the public. The Boston Massacre also set a precedent for how future conflicts would be viewed and remembered. The notion of a just cause gained momentum. The idea that ordinary citizens could stand against a powerful army took root, influencing sentiments that would erupt into open rebellion. The event served as a catalyst for the formation of more organized resistance movements throughout the colonies. Committees of correspondence emerged, facilitating communication and coordination among the colonies, laying the groundwork for a united front against British policies. Historically, the massacre had immediate and far-reaching implications. The trial of the soldiers involved, which began in late 1770, was notable for its unusual outcome. John Adams, a future president and a key figure in the American Revolution, defended the soldiers. He argued that they acted in self-defense, which was a controversial stance at the time given the prevailing public outrage. This trial underscored the complexity of the struggle for justice and the rule of law during a time of rising tensions. Adams' defense highlighted the struggle between upholding justice and catering to public sentiment, a balance that remains relevant in political discourse today. Over the decades, the legacy of the Boston Massacre evolved into a cornerstone of American identity. It symbolized the fight against oppression and the quest for self-determination. Schools, monuments, and memorials were erected in the years following the incident, commemorating those who fell that night. The Boston Massacre site became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to honor the memory of the martyrs. The event was commemorated annually with speeches that filled the air with fervor and resolve. It became a focal point for discussions about liberty and the rights of citizens, shaping the ideals that would culminate in the American Revolution. However, the legacy of the Boston Massacre is not without its complexities. In the years that followed, the narrative constructed around the event sometimes overshadowed the realities of the broader struggle for independence. The focus on martyrdom often simplified the multifaceted issues at play, including economic grievances, political representation, and the diverse motivations of those involved in the revolutionary movement. The event became a symbol, but it also risked becoming a tool for manipulation, serving the interests of some while neglecting the voices of others who contributed to the struggle for independence. In contemporary discussions, the Boston Massacre stands as a reminder of the sacrifices made in the name of freedom. It urges us to reflect on the stories we tell about our past, who is remembered and who is forgotten. The narratives constructed over time hold the power to inspire, but also to distort. As we examine the legacy of the Boston Massacre, we must acknowledge the complexity of its aftermath and the varied experiences of those affected. The event serves as a testament to the human capacity for resilience and resistance in the face of oppression. It reminds us that history is not merely a collection of dates and figures, but a living narrative shaped by the struggles and sacrifices of real people. The bloodshed of that fateful night became a crucible for revolution, igniting a movement that would change the course of history. As the echoes of the past resonate in our present, we are left with the weight of memory, the legacy of those who stood against tyranny. The Boston Massacre, in its raw reality, serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of freedom, urging us to remain vigilant in the pursuit of justice and equality. In this quiet reflection, we may consider a single surviving detail, the memorial at the site of the Boston Massacre, where visitors pause to remember the sacrifices made that night, a testament to the enduring legacy of a struggle for liberty that began with bloodshed and a cry for justice. The Boston Massacre stands as a stark mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. In moments of fear and desperation, individuals can be driven to acts of both courage and cruelty. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, became an emblem of resistance, embodying the struggle for freedom. His death on that fateful March evening in 1770 was not merely a tragic loss. It ignited a flame of revolution, urging others to rise against oppression. The crowd that gathered, composed of laborers, tradesmen, and the ordinary citizens, demonstrated the power of collective voices, showing how unity can arise from shared grievances. On the other side of that tumultuous confrontation, British soldiers, ordered to maintain control amidst rising tensions, found themselves caught in a web of their own making. Captain Thomas Preston and his men were not merely enforcers of the Crown's will, they were also human beings faced with an impossible dilemma. Their actions, driven by fear and the instinct to protect themselves, led to irreversible consequences. It raises a haunting question about the nature of authority and the burdens it imposes on those who wield it. As Samuel Adams rallied the people in the wake of the violence, he tapped into a deep-seated yearning for justice, a reminder that ambition, in its purest form, is often intertwined with the quest for dignity. In the aftermath of the massacre, the trial of the soldiers further complicated the narrative. John Adams, taking on the defense of the accused, recognized the significance of the rule of law even in the face of overwhelming public sentiment. His commitment to justice, despite the risk to his own safety and reputation, highlights a profound aspect of human nature, the capacity for empathy, even toward those deemed adversaries. It reflects the struggle to balance personal beliefs with societal expectations, a struggle that resonates through history and remains relevant today. As the dust settled, the events of that night transformed into a rallying cry for the colonies. The bloodshed galvanized a movement that would ultimately reshape a nation. The Boston Massacre wasn't an isolated incident. It was a catalyst that propelled ordinary individuals into the annals of history, awakening a collective consciousness that would not be silenced. In contemplating this story, we are reminded of the delicate interplay between ambition and the human spirit's resilience. It speaks to our capacity for both compassion and conflict, our longing for justice amid chaos. As you drift into sleep, carry with you the echoes of those who stood for their beliefs in the face of tyranny, and let their courage inspire your own reflections on the enduring nature of humanity. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the past, consider subscribing to Sleeping History Dreams for more long-form historical storytelling each week. Good night, and we'll see you in the next one.